Good afternoon to everyone. It's 2:03. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Rachel Boss. I am the Community Impact Manager in the Bureau of Campaign Finance and Civic Engagement here at the Pennsylvania Department of State. I'm also joined in the room by the Director of the Bureau of Campaign Finance and Civic Engagement, Tiffany Chang Lawson. So we are going to run through our guide to running a voter registration drive in Pennsylvania, and this will primarily be a question and answer webinar. So we're not going to go too in-depth into the contents of the guide, but I hope that you will have an opportunity to review it if you haven't already, and I hope that you've brought some questions that we can talk about today on the webinar. Before we begin, I just want to mention, you will have noticed when you signed in to Zoom that you've all been muted in the webinar. This webinar is being recorded. So what we'll do is you can use the question and answer function to enter your questions in the Zoom toolbar at the top. You'll see the question and answer function. The toolbar may appear at the top or bottom of your screen, and it's there where you see the Q&A icon. You can click on that. And you can enter questions throughout the webinar. I'll review and respond to them when we get to the question and answer portion. And as I said, you can type your questions in the box. I'll read them aloud and respond to the group. I mentioned this webinar is being recorded, so you may access it in the future at votespa.com under resources on the same page where you'll find the guide to running a voter registration drive in Pennsylvania. So to provide some background on how we developed this guide, it was put together by a work group of election stakeholders, and that included Pennsylvania county election officials, the Pennsylvania Department of State, and outside organizations, including nonprofits and good governance groups that are interested in voter registration in Pennsylvania. The main goal of the guide is to provide guidelines and best practices to organizations that want to help citizens register to vote in Pennsylvania. So we hope that the tools and suggestions outlined in the guide will provide you an overview of everything that you need to think about when you're planning and executing a voter registration drive here in PA. And why do we use the guide? Really, it's simple. We want to get voters registered to vote in Pennsylvania. So we all have the same end goal, which is to make sure that everyone doesn't encounter any errors or confusion on election day. They also want to be confident if they register through a voter registration drive that they know that their application is going to be processed completely and correctly, and that, again, when they show up to vote on election day, they're not going to encounter any hitches. So I want to talk through the contents of the guide, just again going through the outline of the guide, so you just have a brief review of what's included, and then we'll get to the question and answer portion. So the first section of the guide is about knowing the rules in Pennsylvania. And you'll see there that the guide will cover who processes the forms, which are the county voter registration offices, whether there are requirements for organizations in Pennsylvania that run a voter registration drive, whether anyone can help others to register to vote. We also provide suggestions about knowing the law and consulting with an attorney if necessary, so that you understand any restrictions your organization may encounter based on your tax-exempt status. And we want to know when to fill out a registration form for voters, any deadlines around voter registration, eligibility, and how to handle questions about voters' addresses when they're registering to vote. The guide also covers how to submit voter registration applications. In Pennsylvania, we have a number of options available to voters and to voter registration drives. There are online voter registration options. You may want to consider developing a web application program interface to use across your organization to register voters. And you always have the option to register voters using a paper application form. The guide also provides an overview of tips that voters and your drive organizers and staff can use for registering voters, both through the online voter registration options as well as using the paper application. You'll notice that there is a section in the guide on poll worker recruitment. So I wanted to just take a moment today to talk about why that's included in the guide. There is a checkbox on the voter registration application in Pennsylvania that asks voters if they're interested in serving as a poll worker. That question is included there because it's another way for interested voters to get engaged in the electoral system. We know that across Pennsylvania and across the country, really, there's a shortage of poll workers. And these are the people who serve on election day in the polling places, checking in voters as they arrive to vote, making sure that they know how to use the voting systems, and providing those wonderful I voted stickers. So I just wanted to make sure that organizations that run voter registration drives in Pennsylvania know that they have an opportunity to recruit voters to serve as poll workers in Pennsylvania. And that's a great way to also engage with people when you're out in the field. The guide also has 3 sections that cover before, during, and after the drive, things that you should keep in consideration as you're planning, executing, and then recapping how everything went. So the before the voter registration drive section of the guide includes information about picking your dates, securing your supplies, communicating with county election officials, and finding and training your workers. There are many considerations that you'll want to keep in mind during the drive, including transparency around your organization, how you will track and manage applications, either online applications or paper applications, what to do when you encounter issues in the field, for example, how to handle questions from voters, and what to do when you get incomplete voter registration applications. And there's also a section about quality control that recommends best practices for ensuring that your staff, volunteers, or workers in the field are really doing a good job of making sure that we're getting complete and accurate voter registration information on those applications. The main point of the after the drive section of the guide is to encourage you to evaluate how everything went. And it includes some recommendations for what data you can look at to ask yourself those important questions of how did we do during this year's voter registration drive. Towards the end of the guide, you'll see that there are some best practices related to voters with special considerations. Those include how to interact with voters with disabilities, voters who have a criminal record, voters who are limited English proficient, high school students, and college students. So it kind of reviews not only how to interact with those communities, but what questions or specific concerns they may have related to voter registration. And lastly, the guide covers some frequently asked questions from voters. So they're listed here, and that information is included in the guide. I did want to make sure to point out that this guide can be a document that is updated over time. You'll see, I think it's right on the second page of the guide, that there will be versioning information. So it will say what version of the guide you have and when it was released. We would love for you to let us know if you find any inconsistencies or if you have questions about the guide contents. And I'll provide you an example. I was recently contacted by a county election administrator who pointed out that page 6 of the current version of the guide says that hand-delivered paper applications must be received by the county election offices by 5 p.m. on the day of the voter registration deadline. But I need to update the guide to say that that should be the close of business. This particular inconsistency also highlights the importance of communicating with county election officials before and during your voter registration drive. If you're in contact with your counties or the county where you're working in, the voter registration office, they can provide you all the information that you need to know. For example, the hours of operation for their offices. And those are the types of information that you would want to find out from the county election office. Some other things that they might be able to communicate to you are what their preference is for receiving bundles of applications. For example, some counties would prefer to have a cover letter along with those applications with contact information so that they know who to reach out to in case they encounter issues with those applications. I also wanted to mention that the Department of State is looking for volunteers to field test this guide. So I mentioned that we are interested in updating the guide and improving it when we find inconsistencies in the information that's presented. But there may be other feedback about things that should be added or ways that the guide could be made more user-friendly or more intuitive to understand. So if your organization is interested in volunteering, you can provide me your information. And what you would do is sign up to implement the guide. And essentially that would be to use the guidelines, use the guide to train your workers ahead of the November 2019 election and follow as best you can the best practices laid out in the guide this fall when you're running your voter registration drive. Then after the election or after the voter registration deadline, we would ask you to provide us some more in-depth feedback using an online survey instrument. So we've arrived at the question and answer portion of our webinar. I'm going to open up our Q&A box here and see if I've gotten any questions. Okay, we have one participant is saying that they can't find the link to download the guide. That's from Paul O'Hanlon. So I have everyone who has registered contact information from the Zoom webinar. So I can send you a link to the guide, Paul, directly, and actually I can plan to follow up with everyone who registered for the webinar in case there are people who intended to attend but weren't able to log in today. And so I can send you all the guide itself, and as well as a link to the webpage where you can find the guide, and this webinar's recording will be hosted. One thing that I've encountered recently, and I think one of the voter registration, one of the organizations that brought this question to my attention just this last week, was what to do if you find that you have a question about a specific Pennsylvania county's practice. So I just kind of wanted to let you know, we would love to know about how things are going with the counties, but the Department of State has a limited ability to counsel counties directly about their practices. What we can do is share our guide with counties where we are made aware of practices that may not be quite in line with what we're recommending. What you can do in terms of a best practice would be to keep track of any irregularities so that you can follow up with the county about them either during the drive or after the drive. That way you can solicit feedback from them about how everything went with processing the applications that your organization submitted, as well as let them know how things went for you and whether you had any troublesome issues related to the county's practices. All right, I am going to bring up my contact information here. So I've just gotten a question. If I'm looking for testers for the guide, how would we follow up on this? What are we looking for? And is there payment for to help with recruitment? So I've just brought my contact information, or rather the contact information for related to this guide for the Department of State on the screen. So there are 2 email addresses where you can reach out, and that would be a good way to contact us. There's also 2 phone numbers that you can call. My name is Rachel Boss, so you can ask to speak with me. That's B-O-S-S is my last name. Or you can ask the question of the person in our elections division who responds to the phone call. So to respond to the question, though, so you would follow up with me by sending an email to one of these email addresses listed. And we are looking for organizations that are planning to run a voter registration drive this fall in 2019, ahead of the 2019 general election. And we would ask that you become familiar with the guidelines in the guide and follow them to the best of your ability, and that you train your staff to follow the guidelines outlined there. And then afterwards, we would send you, the contact person for the organization, a link to an online survey that you would complete to let us know about your experience using the guide and whether you have any feedback for improving it. We do not offer any payment to participate in this field testing. I got another question about what information is being compiled to assist in voter registration as part of the mandate in public high schools and charter schools. The mandate that I am aware of would, I think, and this question comes from Victoria. So Victoria, if you have additional information that you'd like to relay in this question and answer box, please feel free. But my understanding of the mandate that applies to schools relates to students that have an individualized education plan, that they should be afforded the opportunity to register to vote when they're transitioning out of high school and graduating. So we don't currently track that information at the Department of State as far as I'm aware. We do have a high school voter registration program through which we encourage high schools to run voter registration drives and to achieve high levels of voter registration across the entire population of eligible students. That's called the Governor's Civic Engagement Award, and there's more information about that program available on the Votes PA website at votespa.com/GCEA, and that stands for the Governor's Civic Engagement Award. So we've got a question about how are we encouraging schools to participate in the mandate, and what materials do we provide? So we encourage schools to participate in the Governor's Civic Engagement Award program through our networks and various outreach organizations. So we partner with nonprofit organizations that have ties to voter registration efforts in high schools in different areas in the state. We also work with the Pennsylvania Department of Education to do direct outreach to the schools. And in terms of materials, we have a quick guide that's up on that website that I mentioned for the Governor's Civic Engagement Award that administrators and teachers can use to get started with their voter registration drive in their high school. We also provide a pledge card that can be used for students. Even students who are not eligible to register to vote can complete the pledge card to say that I pledge to register when I am eligible, and I pledge to register and vote. Judy Clark Clack has brought to my attention that there's a typo on slide 46 of the PowerPoint version. I see. I think she's referring to the guide. So thank you for bringing that to my attention, and I will make a note of it. So as I mentioned, we do have an error that was brought to our attention, and so we will be issuing an updated version of this guide. And I expect that to be up on the website next week. And you'll know it's an updated version again because you'll be able to check that version information on page 2. So we have another question related to the direct outreach that we do for the Governor's Civic Engagement Award. For example, just this week on Tuesday, I was in Philadelphia for a training for social studies educators in the Philadelphia school system. And so I was there to provide information about the Governor's Civic Engagement Award and provide materials such as voter registration forms and have the educators sign up with us to receive emails through our mailing list. So I'll also mention that the Governor's Civic Engagement Award website does have a place where you can register your school to participate in the program this year. If you register your school, then you would be added to our mailing list, and we would keep you updated about any deadlines and events related to the Governor's Civic Engagement Award. So it looks like Paul's providing some additional information related to the process for registering students with IEPs, and that other ways that schools can satisfy these requirements. So Paul, I would love to follow up with you directly after this webinar to talk about this more and to talk about how we can incorporate this information into the civic engagement work that we do in collaboration with the Department of Education. So you can look for an email from me after the webinar. I don't have additional questions pending if anyone else would like to add one. Oh, Judy says, thanks for your guide. Judy, thank you for participating in the webinar, and thank you to you all for taking the time out of your afternoon. This is a new initiative from the Department of State, so we're very happy to continue to expand on the work that we're doing related to civic engagement and voter registration, and making sure that organizations that run voter registration drives in Pennsylvania have the best resources available to them for making sure that we're all able to successfully register Pennsylvanians to vote. I'm also getting a thank you from Barb. So one last question from Victoria was, who would be best to contact in regard to getting a curriculum to high schools? We are in the process of talking with the Department of Education about making curriculum available to educators related to voter registration. So Victoria, you can contact me at the second email address that you see listed on your screen, the ravoterreg@pa.gov. And again, my name is Rachel. So if you'd like to follow up about high school curriculum around voter registration, I would be the best person to talk to about that. All right, wonderful. We're just coming up on 2:30, so we didn't need the full hour for this time, but I really appreciate everyone's participation and time today. This webinar, I think it will be edited just a little bit and then posted on the website, as I mentioned, votespa.com under the Resource Center. Thank you so much to everyone.